The night air was impossibly cold at 30,000 feet. Captain Sarah Mitchell sat in the cramped cockpit of her B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the control stick as the massive aircraft hummed with barely contained power. Outside her reinforced canopy, nothing existed but darkness, absolute, consuming, infinite. The stars above were her only companions, pinpricks of light scattered across the black velvet of the night sky. Below lay hostile territory, mountainous, unforgiving terrain that had never seen American boots, sheltering secrets that Washington desperately wanted exposed. Sarah had been flying military aircraft for 16 years. She'd logged over 2,000 combat flight hours, earned numerous commendations, and graduated top of her class at test pilot school. But this mission, Operation Silent Thunder, was different. This was the kind of operation that wasn't recorded in official logs, the kind that existed in the gray space between what was legal and what was necessary. The target was a hidden weapons facility, one that intelligence agencies had been tracking for months. The weapons being manufactured inside weren't conventional arms. They were something far more dangerous. Her helmet's heads-up display cast a soft amber glow across her face. Sarah's jaw was tight with concentration, her green eyes scanning instruments that provided real-time data about everything from fuel consumption to atmospheric pressure. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall, lean and muscular from years of demanding physical training. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a tight bun, hidden beneath the helmet. In the darkness of the cockpit, she could have been anyone. A ghost, a shadow, an instrument of precision flying through the night on a mission that no one would ever officially acknowledge. Golden Eagle 17, this is command. You are cleared to proceed to Waypoint Delta. All systems green on our end, crackled a voice through her headset. It was Colonel James Harrison, her commanding officer and the man who had personally selected her for this mission. Harrison's voice was calm, controlled, the voice of someone who had orchestrated countless operations and understood the weight of what was being asked. "Copy that command," Sarah responded, her own voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Golden Eagle 17 systems nominal, entering target zone in approximately 15 minutes, weather conditions optimal, no enemy radar contact. This was the thing about the B-2 Spirit. It was the most advanced piece of military technology ever created. The stealth technology made it nearly invisible to radar systems. It could penetrate the most sophisticated air defense networks without being detected. It was a predator that hunted in darkness, a ghost that materialized only when it was far too late for the enemy to respond. Sarah had always felt something almost sacred about piloting the aircraft. A sense of responsibility that came with operating something so powerful and so secret. As she approached Waypoint Delta, Sarah began reviewing the final approach sequence in her mind. The facility was located in a valley surrounded by mountains, excellent natural cover for both the target and for anti-aircraft positions. Intelligence reports suggested the compound had state-of-the-art radar systems and possibly surface-to-air missile installations, but they were old systems, well known to American defense strategists. The B-2's advanced stealth design should render her invisible to all of them. Should. That word carried weight. In military operations, certainty was a luxury no one could afford. "Command, this is Golden Eagle 17. Beginning final approach sequence," Sarah transmitted. Her hands moved across the instruments with practiced precision. Every switch, every adjustment, every keystroke had been rehearsed dozens of times in simulators and during training flights. But nothing could fully replicate the reality of combat operations, the knowledge that mistakes didn't result in a reset of the simulation, but in death. Sarah thought briefly of her mother, Alina. She was sleeping peacefully 3,000 miles away in their home in Maryland, unaware that her daughter was at this very moment flying one of the most sophisticated weapons platforms ever created over enemy territory. Alina didn't know the details of Sarah's work. The military kept such information compartmentalized. Alina knew only that Sarah was a pilot, that she served her country, and that she was proud of her daughter. Alina had lost Sarah's father to cancer when Sarah was 12. She had poured all of her love and hope into her daughter's life, supporting her ambitions even when they led Sarah into a career that took her far from home, into dangers that Alina could barely comprehend. The thought of her mother was interrupted by a sudden spike in Sarah's instruments. Her radar warning receiver began to chirp, an insistent, urgent sound that made her blood run cold. Missile radar. Active missile radar, locking onto her position. "Command, we have a problem," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain level. "Contact. Missile radar. Surface-to-air installation bearing 270, range approximately 40 kilometers. Copy that, Golden Eagle 17. Stand by." There was a pause, less than 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. In those 3 seconds, Sarah's mind raced through calculations and contingencies. The B-2 was supposed to be undetectable. The stealth technology was supposed to render her invisible. Either the intelligence was wrong, or the enemy had developed new radar systems that the Pentagon wasn't aware of. The chirping of the missile warning receiver grew louder, more insistent. Sarah's eyes widened as the radar contact grew stronger. Whatever had detected her, it wasn't theoretical anymore. It was real, tangible, deadly. Then she saw it, a brilliant flash of orange light that suddenly illuminated the darkness below her aircraft. For a split second, her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Then the world exploded. A surface-to-air missile had pierced the night sky, traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. It struck the B-2's right wing with catastrophic force. The impact was violent and immediate. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder beneath her, felt the terrible sensation of control being ripped away. Alarms shrieked inside the cockpit. Red warning lights flashed like strobes, painting everything in crimson. The aircraft rolled violently to the right, and Sarah's vision blurred as gravitational forces pressed against her body with incredible force. "Mayday, Mayday," Sarah transmitted, her voice suddenly urgent and desperate. "Golden Eagle 17, we are hit by missile, starboard wing compromised, losing hydraulic pressure, losing primary controls." Static crackled through her headset, no response from command. "Mayday, Mayday," she repeated, fighting with the control stick. The aircraft was dying around her, systems failing in cascading sequences. She reached for the ejection handle, a bright yellow and black striped loop mounted above her head. This was it, the moment every pilot trained for but hoped never to face. "Going down," she transmitted one final time. "Going down, tell my mother." She never finished the sentence. The B-2 Spirit tumbled toward the dark mountains below, spiraling toward an impact that would be recorded officially as total loss. As far as the world would ever know, Captain Sarah Mitchell had died that night, consumed by fire and falling metal. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a uniformed Air Force officer who wore the expression of someone delivering the worst possible news. Alina Mitchell was arranging flowers in a blue ceramic vase when she heard the knock at her door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her book club didn't meet until Thursday, and she had no other visitors scheduled. When she opened the door to find the young captain in dress blues standing on her porch, her hands began to tremble involuntarily. "Mrs. Alina Mitchell?" the captain asked, his voice tight and formal. Alina's first instinct was to slam the door. She had read enough news stories, watched enough television dramas, to understand exactly what that uniform and that tone of voice meant. For a moment, she seriously considered closing the door and pretending she had never opened it. If she didn't hear the words, perhaps they wouldn't be true. Reality could be held at bay through sheer force of will. But Alina was 63 years old, and she had lived long enough to know that reality didn't care about what you believed or what you hoped for. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm Alina Mitchell." The captain's expression softened slightly, and Alina realized he couldn't be more than 30 years old. He was someone's son, probably someone's husband. He had been assigned the duty of destroying a mother's world, and he would carry that burden for the rest of his life. Alina almost felt sorry for him. "Ma'am, I'm Captain David Torres from Whiteman Air Force Base. May I come inside?" Alina stepped aside mechanically. Everything after that moment became a blur, a sequence of words and phrases that she would replay thousands of times over the coming months. Aircraft lost, presumed killed in action, search and rescue operations, no survivors expected. The base commander and I offer our deepest condolences. Is there someone we can call for you? Alina's legs had given out somewhere around the second sentence. She found herself sitting on her living room couch without any clear memory of how she got there. Captain Torres was still speaking, but his voice sounded like it was coming from a great distance, muffled and distorted. She stared at his mouth moving, watching words emerge that seemed to have no meaning, no connection to reality. Her daughter, her beautiful, brilliant, extraordinary daughter who had dreamed of flying since she was 5 years old, who had worked relentlessly to achieve that dream, who had become one of the most skilled pilots in the United States Air Force, was gone. Erased, obliterated, reduced to an absence where there had once been presence, to silence where there had once been laughter. Alina's hand moved to her throat. She couldn't breathe properly. The air seemed to have become thick and viscous, difficult to draw into her lungs. She was dimly aware that Captain Torres was asking her questions, that he was offering to call someone to stay with her to arrange for support services. She shook her head mechanically. She didn't want support. She didn't want anyone around her. She wanted to go back in time to the moment before she opened the door, to erase that moment and remain in the world where her daughter was still alive. "I'm a pilot now, Mom," Sarah had said during her last phone call 2 weeks earlier. "They've finally certified me for combat missions in the B-2. It's everything I've ever wanted." Alina had felt a flutter of pride mixed with something deeper and darker, a mother's primal fear for her child's safety, but she had learned not to express that fear. Sarah was an adult, a highly trained professional, someone who had made her own choices about how to live her life. Alina had learned to be proud without revealing her terror. The next 3 weeks became a nightmare of practical arrangements and emotional devastation. The Air Force was efficient. Alina would give them that. They handled the paperwork, arranged the service, coordinated with Arlington National Cemetery. Alina went through the motions like an automaton, making decisions about caskets and flowers and music without feeling anything at all. Shock was nature's anesthetic, she supposed. Grief would come later, would crash over her in waves that would threaten to drown her. But for now, there was only numbness, and the strange, horrible ability to function, despite the destruction of everything that had given her life meaning. Sarah's childhood bedroom was untouched since she'd left for the Air Force Academy 16 years earlier. Alina found herself standing in that doorway frequently, staring at the posters of aircraft that still decorated the walls, the model planes suspended from the ceiling on fishing line. The room smelled of dust and memories. Alina had never had the heart to change it, never wanted to erase the physical evidence of her daughter's childhood dreams. Now those dreams felt like cruel jokes, promises that the universe had never intended to keep. The morning of the memorial service arrived cold and gray. November clouds hung low over Arlington National Cemetery, threatening rain. Alina wore a black dress that someone, she couldn't remember who, had purchased for her. Nothing in her regular wardrobe seemed appropriate for burying her daughter. She moved through the cemetery like a ghost, her arm linked through that of her sister Margaret, who had flown in from California 2 days earlier. Hundreds of military personnel had assembled for the service. Fellow pilots, commanding officers, enlisted personnel who had worked with Sarah in various capacities throughout her career. But there were also civilians, friends from Sarah's childhood, teachers who remembered her brilliance, neighbors who had known her since she was born. All of them had come to pay respects to someone who had loved life with fierce intensity, who had refused to accept limitations, who had reached for the stars and almost touched them. The flag-folding ceremony was the moment that broke Alina completely. A team of military personnel in perfect formation folded the American flag with precise, practiced movements. Each fold was deliberate and ceremonial. The flag was transformed from a large rectangle into a tight triangle, representing the tricorn hat of a Revolutionary War soldier. When it was complete, the senior officer stepped forward and placed it in Alina's trembling hands. On behalf of the President of the United States Air Force, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your daughter's honorable and faithful service, the officer intoned. Alina looked down at the folded flag in her arms. It was impossibly heavy, though it weighed almost nothing. It represented everything: sacrifice, duty, honor, and loss so profound that it threatened to split her in half. She held it against her chest and realized that this was all she would ever have of her daughter again. Memories, photographs, a neatly folded piece of cloth. The cemetery blurred through her tears as she listened to eulogies. Her sister spoke about Sarah's childhood. Sarah's commanding officer spoke about her exceptional service. Fellow pilots spoke about her skills and courage. But none of them could capture what Alina knew: that the world had lost not just a soldier, but a light, a spark of brilliance that could never be replicated or replaced. That night, Alina returned to her empty house and walked directly to Sarah's bedroom. She lay down on Sarah's childhood bed, still clutching the folded flag, and refused to accept the truth that had been forced upon her. Somewhere deep in her heart, beneath the shock and the grief, Alina held on to something: a mother's inexplicable faith, a stubborn refusal to surrender hope. She didn't know why she felt it, couldn't explain it logically. But as she lay in the darkness, Alina whispered a prayer to a daughter she believed was somehow, impossibly, still alive. "Come home, baby," she whispered into the darkness. "Please come home to me." The ejection sequence was violent and disorienting. Sarah's finger found the bright yellow and black striped handle above her head just as the B-2 began its final, catastrophic dive toward the mountains below. She yanked with all her strength, and explosive charges detonated in rapid succession. The canopy shattered away into the night sky. Her seat rocketed upward, propelled by solid rocket motors, tearing her away from the dying aircraft. For a brief, breathtaking moment, she was airborne, suspended between the aircraft she had piloted and the earth that awaited her below. The parachute deployed with a violent jolt that knocked the wind from her lungs. Sarah's vision exploded with white light as her body absorbed the shock of the opening chute. For several seconds she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but hang suspended in the darkness, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Then gradually her breathing returned. Her vision cleared. She was alive. Impossibly, inexplicably, she was still alive. The descent seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Sarah could see the ground approaching, dark shapes of mountains and valleys becoming increasingly distinct as she fell. She tried to steer the parachute toward what appeared to be a relatively flat area, pulling on the toggles to adjust her trajectory. But the wind had other ideas. It pushed her toward the jagged peaks, toward rocky outcroppings that promised broken bones at best, death at worst. She hit hard, much harder than she had anticipated. Her right leg struck a large boulder first, and pain exploded through her entire body. Her left shoulder slammed against solid ground, and she heard a sickening crack that she knew immediately meant dislocation. Her head struck something hard enough to see stars, and warm blood began trickling down the side of her face. She lay in the darkness, gasping, cataloging her injuries. Broken right leg, no, fracture but not complete break, dislocated left shoulder, possible concussion, lacerations across her forehead and left arm. But she was alive. Sarah's training kicked in with mechanical precision. She had to survive. Survival was the mission now. She disconnected herself from the parachute, grimacing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body. She crawled toward a cluster of rocks that might provide shelter, moving with agonizing slowness. Every breath hurt. Every movement was an exercise in controlled agony. She found a crevasse between two large stones and wedged herself inside, pulling the parachute partially over her as camouflage and insulation against the freezing night air. She spent the night awake, shivering uncontrollably, waiting for sunrise that seemed impossibly far away. She fought the urge to slip into unconsciousness, knowing that with a possible concussion, losing consciousness could be fatal. Instead, she lay in the darkness and thought of her mother, of the base back at Whiteman, of the cottage she had rented in Kansas City where she had been planning to spend her next leave. When dawn came, it brought no relief. Sarah's situation was dire. She was injured in hostile territory with no communication equipment and no way to signal for rescue. The enemy would be searching for her. They would have seen the aircraft go down. They would be combing these mountains, looking for wreckage and survivors. Sarah had perhaps hours, maybe only minutes, before they found her. She was gathering water from a small stream using her flight suit when she heard the voices, men shouting in a language she didn't recognize. Her heart rate immediately elevated. She pressed herself against the cliff face, trying to become invisible, but it was too late. A group of armed men emerged from the trees, 6 of them, dressed in a mix of military uniforms and civilian clothes. They were rough men with hard eyes, faces scarred by violence and conflict. One of them spotted her almost immediately. "There," he shouted, raising his rifle. Sarah considered running. She was injured, but adrenaline could carry her through pain. But there was nowhere to run. The mountain was open terrain. They would shoot her down easily. So she did the only thing she could do. She raised her hands above her head and stepped out from her hiding place. The men rushed toward her, weapons raised. One of them struck her across the face with the butt of his rifle, and her vision exploded with pain. She tasted blood in her mouth, felt her lips split open. They shouted questions at her in their language, words she couldn't understand, grabbing her roughly and forcing her to the ground. Her shoulder screamed in protest as they wrenched her arm behind her back, and she nearly lost consciousness from the pain. "I'm a pilot," she said in English, gasping. "United States Air Force. I have rights under the Geneva Convention. I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell." One of the men laughed, a harsh, cruel sound. He said something to the others and they laughed as well. Sarah realized in that moment that the Geneva Convention meant nothing here. These were not soldiers of a recognized military. They were militia, possibly terrorists, definitely men who played by no rules. They forced her into the back of a transport vehicle, a canvas-covered truck that smelled of diesel fuel and decay. Her hands were bound with rough rope that cut into her wrists. She was thrown onto a metal floor and held down by 2 guards who never said a word, just gripped her arms with bruising force. As the truck jolted and bounced over rough mountain roads, Sarah stared into the darkness and tried to think of anything except the terrible possibilities that awaited her at their destination. The compound was hidden in a valley, surrounded by high concrete walls topped with razor wire. Guard towers stood at each corner, manned by armed sentries. The truck came to a stop inside the compound, and Sarah was hauled out roughly. Her injured leg gave way beneath her weight, and she fell to the ground. The guards who picked her up showed no sympathy, dragging her across the courtyard. They threw her into a cell, a concrete box barely larger than a closet, with a single barred window too high to reach and a metal toilet in the corner. The door clanged shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed in her bones. Sarah stood in the darkness, alone, and allowed herself one moment of complete despair. One moment where she acknowledged the terrible reality of her situation. Then she straightened her spine, forced the despair back down into the depths where she could contain it, and began to think like a pilot again. Analysis, planning, survival. She had been trained for this, not the specific circumstances, but the fundamental principles. Survive, endure, never surrender, never break. She had no idea how long she would be held. She didn't know if the Air Force even knew she was alive. But as she sat on the cold concrete floor of that dark cell, Sarah Mitchell made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would escape. She would find her way home to her mother, no matter how long it took, no matter what price she had to pay. Failure was not an option. Time lost all meaning in the concrete cell. Sarah marked the passage of days by scratching thin lines into the cell wall with a piece of metal she had worked loose from the bed frame. 1 line per day. Simple, undeniable, a physical record of her existence, proof that she was still alive even though the world had forgotten her. After the first month, she stopped counting the individual days and began counting by weeks. After the first year, she started grouping the scratches into sets of 100. The interrogations began almost immediately. The men who questioned her were professionals, not soldiers but intelligence officers of some kind, trained in the art of extracting information from captured prisoners. They understood that Sarah was valuable. She was American military. She was a pilot. She knew secrets. Whether she possessed the specific secrets they wanted was secondary to the fact that she might know them. The first interrogation lasted 16 hours. Sarah was strapped to a metal chair in a concrete room illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights. The men, there were 3 of them, rotating shifts, asked the same questions over and over in accented English. What were the B-2's capabilities? What was the target? Who else knew about the operation? What were the access codes, the security protocols, the classified designations? Sarah said nothing. She had been trained in survival techniques, in how to resist interrogation. She knew the basic military principles: name, rank, serial number. No more. But knowing the principles and surviving the reality were 2 different things. When they began to hurt her, when they applied pressure in ways that were calculated to cause maximum pain without permanent damage, Sarah discovered reserves of mental toughness she didn't know she possessed. She learned to retreat into herself, to partition her mind, to acknowledge the pain without allowing it to control her. "I am Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force," she repeated like a mantra, hour after hour. "I can provide my name, rank, and serial number, nothing more." They grew frustrated with her silence. They tried different approaches. They offered her food if she would talk. They threatened worse punishments if she didn't. They told her that the Air Force had written her off, that no one was coming for her, that she would spend the rest of her life in this cell. Some of this was probably true. Sarah had to accept that possibility. She had to come to terms with the likelihood that her mother believed her dead, that her Air Force career was over, that this concrete cell might be her home for whatever remained of her life. The physical torture lasted approximately 6 months. After that, the interrogators seemed to give up on extracting information through violence. Perhaps they realized that Sarah would die before she broke. Perhaps their superiors decided that a dead prisoner was worthless. Whatever the reason, the severe beating stopped. But the interrogations continued, taking new forms: psychological pressure, isolation, deprivation. Sarah learned to survive on minimal food: thin soup that was more water than substance, stale bread that tasted like dirt, occasionally a piece of meat so old and rancid that she had to force it down despite her body's protests. Her weight dropped precipitously. She could count her ribs. Her clothes hung on her like rags, but her mind remained sharp. She refused to allow her body's deterioration to weaken her mental discipline. Established routines, rituals that gave structure to the endless days. At dawn, judged by the faint light that penetrated her small window, she performed exercises: push-ups, sit-ups, squats, stretches. Her injured leg had healed enough to support her weight, though it ached constantly. She did what she could, pushing her weakened body to maintain minimum fitness. The guards who watched through the cell window sometimes laughed at her efforts. A woman in a concrete cell doing push-ups to stay in shape. It was absurd. Pointless, futile. But it wasn't. Every push-up was an act of defiance. Every moment she maintained discipline was a refusal to surrender. Every day she woke up and did her exercises was a promise to herself that she would survive, that she would escape, that failure was not an option. She meditated. She closed her eyes and retreated into her mind, visualizing the places she loved. Her childhood home, the beach in North Carolina where she had spent one perfect summer, the cockpit of her B-2, that sacred space where she had felt most alive. She visualized her mother's face, though the image grew hazier as years passed. She couldn't quite remember the exact timbre of her mother's voice anymore. That loss, the fading of memory, was almost worse than the physical captivity. She counted things. She calculated pi to 70 decimal places using only her mind. She recited the periodic table of elements. She mentally flew every training mission she had ever flown, recreating each flight in perfect detail from takeoff to landing. These mental exercises kept her sharp, kept her mind from descending into madness that would be the true end. Occasionally she glimpsed other prisoners, a man in the cell across from hers, another woman in a cell down the corridor. Sometimes she heard screaming, sometimes she heard silence. She never learned their names. She never knew what happened to them. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. On bad days, and there were many bad days, Sarah questioned whether survival was worth the cost, whether this half-life of captivity was truly better than death. On those days, she thought of her mother, Eleanor. She imagined that her mother was somewhere in the world, unable to forget her, refusing to accept that her daughter was gone. That thought was sometimes enough to sustain her through another day. The years accumulated. 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. The scratches on the wall multiplied until they covered nearly every surface. Sarah developed a calendar on the wall, crude but functional, marking off the passage of months and years. She had been captured in October 2010. By her count, it was now 2015, 5 years, half a decade of her life stolen, 15 years of life remaining if she lived to 80. The mathematics were depressing. But with the passage of years came a strange kind of acceptance. She had adapted to captivity the way humans adapt to anything. The horror of the first weeks gave way to the grim reality of long-term survival. Her body had changed. She was thinner, scarred, older. But her mind had developed new strength. She understood now that she was capable of enduring things she had never imagined could be endured. That knowledge was paradoxically empowering. She stopped expecting rescue. She stopped waiting for the military to come bursting through the door. She had to accept the possibility that she would die here, in this concrete cell, forgotten by the world. That acceptance was liberating in a strange way. It meant she had no reason to despair. She had already lost everything. All that remained was the simple act of continuing to breathe, to move, to think, to exist. On the day she scratched her 36th line into the wall, 15 years of captivity completed, Sarah Mitchell lay on her concrete bed and whispered her mother's name into the darkness. She didn't know if Eleanor was still alive. She didn't know if anyone in the world remembered her, but she was still here, still fighting, still refusing to surrender. And somewhere, impossibly, that was enough. The intelligence breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon in the CIA's Regional Operations Center. A human asset, a former militia member who had grown disgusted with the organization and had been secretly cooperating with American intelligence for the past 2 years, provided the location of the compound. It was hidden in a valley near the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, exactly where analysts had suspected but had never been able to confirm. The asset provided something even more valuable, confirmation that an American female pilot was being held there, still alive, after 15 years. The information was relayed immediately up the chain of command. Pentagon officials who had given up hope years ago suddenly found themselves reading intelligence reports that seemed almost too incredible to believe. A female B-2 pilot missing since 2010 was alive in a militant compound. The operational response was immediate. Within 24 hours, a special operations team was assembling at Bagram Airfield. Delta Force operators, Navy SEALs, and intelligence specialists began intensive mission planning. General Marcus Coleman, Sarah's former commanding officer, was briefed on the intelligence. When he read the confirmation that Sarah Mitchell might still be alive, he sat in silence for several minutes, processing the information. He had attended her memorial service. He had watched her mother accept the folded flag. He had written letters of commendation for her service. And now, impossibly, she might be alive. "Prepare a team," he ordered. "I don't care what it takes or how much it costs. We bring her home." The compound was photographed by satellite imagery. Every building, every wall, every guard post was documented and analyzed. The Special Operations team studied the compound until they could navigate it in their sleep. They identified 3 possible locations where Sarah might be held. The plan was surgical. Insert at night, clear buildings, extract the asset, exfiltrate before enemy reinforcements could arrive. The mission was designated Operation Second Chance. At 2200 hours on March 15, 2025, 4 MH-47 Chinook helicopters lifted off from their staging area. 24 operators sat in the dark interior, each man focused on the task ahead. They had served in countless operations across hostile territory, but this one felt different. This wasn't just rescuing a soldier. This was recovering a symbol, a pilot who had survived 15 years in captivity and had never broken. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rivera was the team leader. He had spent his career conducting high-risk operations in denied areas, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the emotion he felt about this particular mission. He thought about Sarah Mitchell's file, about her photograph in the dossier, a young, vibrant woman with intelligent green eyes and an almost defiant expression. 15 years ago, that woman had disappeared. What would they find now? The helicopters descended into the valley at 2:30 hours, dropping the team 3 kilometers from the compound. The operators immediately moved into tactical formation, moving silently through the darkness with their night vision goggles. Every sense was heightened. Every shadow could hide an enemy combatant. The night air was cold, crisp, perfect for an operation. No moon, good visibility through the goggles, minimal sound. They reached the compound perimeter at 2:45 hours. The guards on the walls hadn't changed position in the 17 minutes it had taken to move into position. This was typical of untrained militia, predictable, complacent, arrogant. The operators were anything but complacent. They moved into position, established overwatch, and waited for the signal. Rivera pressed his radio transmitter. "Team 1 ready." "Ready," came the response. "Team 2 ready." "Ready." "Go, go, go." The operation unfolded with terrible precision. The guards never saw what hit them. Operators appeared from the darkness like ghosts, silenced weapons eliminating the threat before alarm could be raised. The front gate was breached. Operators poured into the compound, moving toward the pre-identified buildings. The main cell block was the 3rd building, a 2-story concrete structure that housed approximately 20 prisoners. Rivera led his team directly to it. The door was locked, but locks meant nothing to operators equipped with breaching charges. The door exploded inward and the team rushed inside. They moved through the corridor, opening cells one by one. They found 3 prisoners in the first row, men, malnourished, confused, some barely conscious. Not Sarah. "Keep moving," Rivera ordered. The second corridor revealed more prisoners. An older woman, another man, still not Sarah. Rivera's jaw tightened. They had confirmed the location. She was supposed to be here. Had intelligence failed them? Had the asset been wrong? Then they found her. She was in the last cell, locked behind a reinforced door. When the operators breached it, they found her lying on a concrete floor in near-total darkness. She didn't move. For a terrible moment, Rivera thought they were too late, that she was dead. But then her eyes opened. Green eyes exactly like in the photograph, though haunted and hollow. She stared at the operators in full tactical gear, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "Captain Sarah Mitchell?" Rivera asked. Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She tried to sit up, and Rivera realized the true horror of her condition. She was skeletal. Her skin hung on her frame. She weighed perhaps 90 pounds. Her right shoulder was slightly misaligned from the old dislocation, never properly treated, but she was alive. "I'm Senior Chief Marcus Rivera, United States Navy," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "We're American. We're here to bring you home." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "This is a dream," she whispered, her voice barely audible after years of silence. "No, ma'am, this is real. Can you stand?" Sarah tried to move, and her legs simply wouldn't support her weight. 15 years of captivity had taken everything from her body. Rivera lifted her carefully, mindful of her fragility. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. "We've got her," he transmitted, "exfiltrating now." The operation's second phase was extraction. Rivera carried Sarah back through the compound toward the extraction point. Behind them, other operators were bringing out the remaining prisoners. Enemy forces were beginning to respond. Gunfire echoed in the distance, muzzle flashes illuminating the darkness. But the operators maintained their discipline, moving methodically toward the extraction zone. The helicopters were waiting, rotors turning, ready for immediate departure. Rivera climbed aboard and placed Sarah gently on a stretcher. A combat medic immediately began assessing her condition, starting an IV line, checking vitals, communicating with the base hospital about her medical status. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah stared out at the compound disappearing into darkness below. She had been there for 15 years. Every day she had scratched a line on the wall. Every day she had believed this moment would come. And now it was real. She looked up at Rivera. "My mother," she whispered. "Eleanor Mitchell, is she?" "We'll find out," Rivera said. "Right now we're getting you to safety." Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to believe, for the first time in 15 years, that she might actually live, that she might actually go home. As the helicopter crossed into Afghan airspace, Sarah Mitchell drifted into sleep, her hand gripping the collar of Rivera's tactical vest. She had survived. She had endured. She had refused to break. And now, finally, impossibly, she was coming home. The Pentagon's classified medical facility was state-of-the-art, designed to handle the most severe cases of military trauma. Sarah Mitchell was assigned to a private wing on the 4th floor, a secure area where she could begin the long process of recovery. The first 3 days, she barely left her bed. Her body was so depleted that even sitting up required tremendous effort. The medical team that examined her consisted of specialists in trauma recovery, infectious diseases, orthopedic surgery, and psychiatry. Dr. Elizabeth Chen was the lead physician. She was a woman in her 50s with gray streaking her dark hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. When she first examined Sarah, Dr. Chen had to step out of the room for several minutes to compose herself. She had never seen a human being in such a state of physical deterioration, who was still alive and conscious. "Your blood work is remarkable," Dr. Chen said during one of her daily rounds. "Most people in your condition would have organ failure, severe anemia, complete nutritional collapse. But your blood work is actually recovering faster than I would have predicted. Your body is fighting back." Sarah lay in the hospital bed, staring out the window at a view of trees and manicured grass that seemed impossibly beautiful. She had not seen green things in 15 years, real growing things. Not the sparse desert vegetation that had been visible through her cell window, but actual vibrant trees with leaves. It was almost too much for her brain to process. "How long?" Sarah whispered. "How long for what?" "For me to be normal again." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "That depends on your definition of normal, Captain Mitchell. Your body needs time, 3 to 6 months, possibly longer, before you regain significant strength. But your mind is the real question. The trauma you've experienced is severe. Most people would not have survived it intact." The physical rehabilitation program was brutal. Sarah was started on small meals. Her stomach had to be gradually reintroduced to regular food. She received vitamins and mineral supplements. She underwent physical therapy every day, starting with the simplest movements, flexing her fingers, rotating her wrists, lifting her arms. Her muscles had atrophied almost completely. By the second week, she was sitting up without assistance. By the third week, she was standing with help, her legs shaking beneath her like a newborn foal. The physical therapist, a tough woman named Sergeant Martinez, was relentlessly encouraging. "Come on, Captain. You've done harder things than this," Martinez would say. "You survived 15 years of captivity. You can survive 2 minutes on a treadmill at the slowest setting." Sarah pushed herself with the same discipline that had kept her alive in her cell. She did the exercises. She consumed the calories. She sat through the psychological evaluations, answering questions from Dr. Raymond Park, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and captivity survivors. "Do you feel suicidal?" Dr. Park asked during one session. "No," Sarah said simply. "Do you feel angry?" "Yes." "At whom?" "Everyone, no one, myself. It's complicated." Dr. Park nodded. He had seen this before in other POW survivors. The anger was complicated because it had nowhere clean to go. She was angry at her captors, but they were faceless, beyond her reach. She was angry at herself for being captured in the first place, an irrational anger but no less powerful. She was angry at the world for moving on without her, at her mother for having to mourn her, at everyone in the Air Force who had continued their lives while she was forgotten. "Trauma like yours requires time," Dr. Park said. "Don't expect to be whole quickly." By the end of the first month, Sarah had gained 15 pounds. The physical transformation was visible. Her cheekbones were still prominent, but her face was no longer skull-like. Her ribs were still visible, but the gaps between them were beginning to fill. She was slowly becoming human again. General Marcus Coleman visited her on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. He sat in the chair beside her bed, and for several minutes, neither of them spoke. "How are you feeling?" he finally asked. "Alive," Sarah said, "which is more than I expected 15 years ago." Coleman nodded. "You've been recommended for promotion to major. It's automatic given your circumstances, but I wanted to tell you in person." Sarah absorbed this information without emotion. Promotion, a rank she had never expected to achieve, a recognition of service that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. "The reason I'm here," Coleman continued, "is to ask you about your future. The Air Force will take care of you. You'll receive full benefits, disability payments, counseling. You can have a quiet life. You've earned it." But Sarah sensed there was more. "But I heard something from the rehabilitation staff. They say you've been asking about flight simulators, that you've been talking about wanting to fly again." Sarah looked at him directly. "I want to fly the B-2 again. That's what I do. That's who I am." "That's going to be complicated," Coleman said carefully. "You have to understand you've experienced severe trauma. There will be psychological evaluations. There will be questions about your fitness to operate one of the most complex and expensive aircraft in the world." "I understand," Sarah said, "but I also understand that I'm still capable. I'm stronger than I was when I was captured. I'm sharper. If you don't believe me, put me through every evaluation, every test, every simulator session you want. I'll pass them all." Coleman studied her face. He saw something in her eyes, an unwavering determination, a refusal to accept limitations. He had seen that same quality in her when she was younger, before the mission, before the capture. She had never been someone who quit. "All right," he said. "I'll arrange the evaluations. But Sarah, be patient with yourself. The Air Force has been waiting for you for 15 years. It can wait a few more months while you heal." Over the next 8 weeks, Sarah underwent intensive physical and psychological testing, flight surgeon evaluations, G-force tolerance tests, cognitive function assessments, mental health evaluations. Every test was designed to determine whether she was capable of returning to flight operations. And she passed every single one. The psychologists were particularly impressed. Sarah's mental resilience was extraordinary. She had been tortured, imprisoned, deprived, and isolated, and yet her cognitive function was intact. Her reasoning was sound. Her judgment was sharp. If anything, the experience had given her a clarity and perspective that many of her peers lacked. By late May, the final evaluation was complete. A board of senior officers reviewed Sarah's file and made a determination. Major Sarah Mitchell was cleared for limited flight operations, contingent on additional training and oversight. She was approved to participate in the upcoming air show at Nellis Air Force Base. When General Coleman delivered this news, Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of complete emotional release. Tears streamed down her face, not from weakness but from relief. She had reclaimed something of herself. She was no longer just a prisoner, no longer just a victim. She was a pilot again. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "Don't thank me," Coleman said. "What you've done, what you've survived, that's all you, Sarah, all you." Sarah looked out the window at the green trees, at the sky stretching endlessly above them, and for the first time since her rescue, she allowed herself to imagine the future. Not a future defined by her captivity, but a future where she soared again. The week leading up to the Nellis Air Show was shrouded in secrecy. Sarah's participation was classified until the last possible moment. Officially, the public knew only that a B-2 Spirit would perform an aerial demonstration. They had no idea who would be piloting it. The military strategists understood that the impact would be maximized by the revelation at the moment of takeoff. Sarah spent the days before the show reviewing flight procedures, updating herself on the B-2's most recent system modifications. The aircraft had been updated significantly since 2010. There were new navigation systems, improved targeting capabilities, enhanced stealth features, but the fundamental flying characteristics remained the same. The B-2 was still the most elegant aircraft she had ever piloted, a flying wing that responded to her touch like an extension of her own mind. She flew simulator missions for 6 hours a day, pushing herself through every possible scenario. Engine failures, system malfunctions, unusual attitudes, emergency procedures. By the end of each session, sweat soaked her flight suit, but her hands were steady and her confidence was building. She had spent 15 years thinking about flying. Now, finally, she was about to do it again. The night before the show, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her quarters at Nellis Air Force Base and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow she would be airborne. Tomorrow she would feel the G-forces pressing her into her seat. Tomorrow she would control $300 million of cutting-edge military technology and feel the sky beneath her wings. But more importantly, tomorrow she would make a public statement. She would prove to herself and to the world that captivity had not broken her. That trauma had not destroyed her spirit. At 600 hours, Sarah reported to the Flight Operations Center. She went through the pre-flight briefing with her squadron commander, a young colonel named Jennifer Shaw who had tremendous respect for Sarah's determination. The weather was perfect, clear Nevada skies, minimal wind, excellent visibility. All systems on the B-2 were nominal. "You ready for this?" Shaw asked. Sarah nodded. "I've been ready for 15 years." The walk to the aircraft was surreal. Sarah moved across the tarmac in her flight suit, oxygen mask dangling around her neck, helmet in her hands. Ground crew members stopped what they were doing to watch her pass. By now, word had leaked among the military personnel that the pilot for today's demonstration was someone special, someone with an extraordinary story. The B-2 Spirit sat on the tarmac like a massive black manta ray, its distinctive flying wing silhouette immediately recognizable. Sarah had always found the aircraft beautiful in an almost ethereal way. It was a machine designed for stealth, for invisibility, for delivering destructive power without warning. But right now, to Sarah, it represented something else entirely. It represented freedom. It represented reclamation. It represented victory over the forces that had tried to destroy her. She climbed the boarding ladder and settled into the cockpit. The familiar sensation of the ejection seat beneath her, the control stick in her hand, the instruments glowing softly before her. It was like coming home. For a moment, tears threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced them back. She had work to do. B-207, you are cleared for engine startup, the tower announced. Copy, tower, Sarah responded. Her voice was steady, professional, giving no indication of the emotional tempest roiling beneath her calm exterior. The engines spooled up with their distinctive deep rumble. The ground shook beneath the aircraft. Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, each switch and button confirming that the aircraft was ready for flight. All systems green, all systems nominal. Inside the observation area, over 20,000 spectators had assembled. Military personnel, civilians, families. The morning air buzzed with anticipation. An announcer stood at a podium, reviewing the schedule for the day's demonstrations. And then, as the B-2's engines reached full power, the announcer's tone changed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a special moment to share with you today," the announcer said, his voice trembling slightly. 15 years ago, Captain Sarah Mitchell was declared killed in action when her B-2 was shot down over hostile territory. She survived. She was held captive for those 15 years. This morning, Major Sarah Mitchell will fly that B-2 you see on the runway. She will demonstrate that the human spirit cannot be broken, that determination overcomes adversity, and that our service members will never be forgotten. In the VIP observation area, Alina Mitchell sat in a chair, her hands trembling. She had been told the night before, but being told and actually seeing it were two different things. Her daughter, her baby, was about to take to the skis in an aircraft that had nearly killed her. Alina wasn't sure if she should be terrified or thrilled. She settled for both. "Tower B-207 requesting taxi clearance," Sarah transmitted. "B-207 cleared to taxi to runway 27. Welcome home, ma'am." Those three words, "welcome home," seemed to unlock something in Sarah. She felt tears on her cheeks as she guided the massive aircraft across the tarmac. Welcome home. That's exactly what this was. The takeoff roll was exhilarating. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and the B-2 accelerated down the runway. The acceleration pressed her back into her seat. The runway markers flashed past. At 220 knots, she pulled back on the control stick, and the aircraft lifted into the Nevada sky. The roar of the crowd below was inaudible inside the cockpit, but Sarah could imagine it. She could feel the moment, the collective gasp of 20,000 people as the black stealth bomber climbed into the blue sky, piloted by a woman who had been written off as dead. Sarah executed a gentle turn, climbing steadily to altitude. The B-2 responded to her touch like it had been waiting for her all these years. She felt the familiar sensation of G-forces against her body, the pressure that had once terrified her but now felt like an embrace. She was flying. She was actually flying. From the ground, Alina watched the black aircraft climb higher and higher, becoming a speck against the blue sky. Her daughter was up there, soaring, alive, triumphant. Alina's tears flowed freely now, tears of joy and relief and profound gratitude. Sarah pushed the aircraft to a more aggressive attitude, executing a series of banking turns that showcased the B-2's remarkable agility despite its enormous size. Down below, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Some people were crying. Others were shouting. All of them understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a woman who had survived the unsurvivable, flying the aircraft that had nearly been her tomb. In the cockpit, Sarah performed a roll, a slow, elegant maneuver that exposed the aircraft's belly to the sky. For a moment, she was upside down, looking down at the ground above her head. Her life was literally inverted, and she had never felt more right. She transmitted one message to the tower: "B-207 is feeling good, absolutely phenomenal." And it was true. For the first time since her capture, Sarah felt completely whole. She had reclaimed her life. She had reclaimed her identity as a pilot. She had reclaimed her future. As she turned toward the landing pattern, Sarah looked down at the tiny figure in the VIP section, her mother standing and waving. Alina probably couldn't see her in return, couldn't know her daughter was looking down at her, but Sarah saw her. And in that moment, everything made sense. All the years of suffering, all the years of survival, all led to this moment. A mother finally seeing her daughter whole again, soaring through the sky like she was meant to. Sarah Mitchell landed her B-2 perfectly, the massive aircraft touching down on the runway with barely a tremor. As she slowed and taxied back to the ramp, the cheers from the crowd were deafening. She was home. She was home. The moment Sarah's B-2 came to rest on the tarmac, the entire base erupted into chaos. Personnel poured out of buildings and hangars. Military members stood at attention, saluting the aircraft. Support vehicles swarmed around the B-2, their sirens wailing in celebration rather than alarm. By the time Sarah had powered down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, tears were streaming down the faces of thousands of people. General Marcus Coleman stood at the base of the boarding ladder, his uniform immaculate, his expression one of profound pride. When Sarah descended the ladder and stepped onto the tarmac, he took her hand and escorted her to the waiting crowd. Alina Mitchell pushed through the throng of military personnel, ignoring protocol and decorum. She reached her daughter, and for a moment, the entire nation held its breath as a mother and daughter embraced for the first time in 15 years. "My baby," Alina whispered into Sarah's shoulder. "My baby, you came home." Sarah held her mother with a strength born from years of survival. She had sustained herself through captivity by imagining this moment. Now that it was real, the flood of emotion threatened to overwhelm her. She was no longer Captain Sarah Mitchell, the unbreakable soldier. She was Sarah, someone's daughter, someone who had been loved and waited for. The days following the air show were a whirlwind of interviews, medical evaluations, and official ceremonies. News networks broadcast Sarah's story continuously. She had become the face of American resilience and determination. The military decorated her with additional commendations. The president personally called to congratulate her. But more importantly, Sarah's return sparked a national conversation about the thousands of missing service members whose cases remained open, the families who still waited for their loved ones to come home. The Pentagon launched a renewed initiative to investigate cold cases of missing military personnel. Resources were allocated. New technologies were deployed. Intelligence agencies reopened files that had been gathering dust for decades. Sarah's return gave hope to families who had nearly surrendered to despair. If she could survive 15 years and return, perhaps others could too. Sarah granted her first formal interview 3 weeks after the air show. She sat in a television studio, her mother beside her, and spoke calmly about her ordeal. She didn't dwell on the suffering. Instead, she focused on the psychological strategies that had sustained her: meditation, routine, purposeful thinking, the refusal to surrender. When asked how she had maintained hope for so long, Sarah paused for a long moment. "I didn't maintain hope," she said quietly. "Hope is too fragile to depend on in a situation like that. What I maintained was discipline. I maintained the discipline to exercise, to think clearly, to refuse to break. And somewhere underneath that discipline, underneath the survival imperative, was something deeper, a stubborn refusal to let my captors define me. They tried to make me a prisoner. I refused to become one." The interview went viral. Military psychologists cited it in training materials. Leadership academies used it as a case study in resilience. Sarah became an unofficial ambassador for trauma recovery, speaking to military audiences about survival and healing. She was careful not to present herself as an inspiration. She rejected that characterization. "I'm not inspirational," she would tell audiences. "I just did what anyone would do. I survived. Survival is the most basic human instinct. What I'm trying to communicate is that survival isn't always easy, but it's always possible if you maintain your discipline and your sense of purpose." Sarah returned to active duty as a flight instructor and mentor to young pilots. She continued to fly the B-2, though now under less stringent restrictions. She participated in training missions, aerial demonstrations, and strategic operations. Some of her students initially treated her with reverence, but Sarah quickly dispelled that notion. She demanded excellence from them and showed no favoritism based on her own extraordinary experiences. "Your personal story doesn't matter in the cockpit," she would tell her students. "What matters is your preparation, your focus, and your respect for the aircraft and the mission. I survived 15 years in captivity because I maintained discipline. You will become excellent pilots for the same reason." Her reunion with her mother became a model for post-trauma family reconstruction. Alina had to learn to see her daughter not as the young woman who had disappeared, but as a woman who had been fundamentally changed by her experiences. Sarah carried scars, physical and emotional, that would never completely heal. She suffered from occasional nightmares. She was occasionally triggered by confinement or loud noises. But with therapy, time, and Alina's patient love, they rebuilt their relationship. Alina attended every air show where Sarah flew. She stood in the VIP section, watching her daughter command the sky, and wept with gratitude. Sarah would always make a special pass over the observation area, a subtle acknowledgement of her mother's presence, a way of saying, "This is for you. This is because you never stopped believing I would come home." 1 year after her rescue, Sarah was promoted to major in a formal ceremony. The ceremony was televised. The general presiding over the promotion spoke about Sarah's service, her sacrifice, and her extraordinary courage. But when Sarah accepted her new insignia, she thought only of the young woman she had been 15 years earlier, the pilot who had dreamed of command and had been willing to die for her country. 2 years after her rescue, the Pentagon commissioned a documentary about her story. Filmmakers followed her for 6 months, recording her daily life, her training sessions, her interactions with her mother. When the documentary premiered, it was watched by millions. Critics praised its honesty and emotional power, but more importantly, the documentary raised awareness about military trauma and recovery. Mental health resources for service members increased. Protocols for POW recovery improved. Sarah's suffering had meaning beyond her personal redemption. By the 5th anniversary of her rescue, Sarah had become something more than just a pilot or a soldier. She had become a symbol of human resilience, a living proof that the human spirit could endure almost anything. She was invited to speak at universities, at corporate events, at international conferences. She declined most invitations, preferring to remain focused on her military duties and her relationship with her mother. But occasionally, when she felt a particular presentation could make a difference, she would accept. She would stand before audiences and speak about survival, about discipline, about the power of maintaining purpose even in the darkest circumstances. And inevitably, people would approach her afterward with tears in their eyes, telling her that her story had changed their perspective, had given them hope, had helped them face their own challenges with renewed determination. Sarah never accepted credit for these transformations. She understood that her story had simply given people permission to be stronger. In a world that often celebrated victims, Sarah represented something else, the possibility of victors. Not victors over others, but victors over circumstances, over despair, over the forces that tried to diminish the human spirit. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sit with her mother in the small garden behind Alina's house. They would watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and red, and they would simply be together, two women bound by love, separated by tragedy, and reunited by an inexplicable miracle. "Do you ever regret coming back?" Alina asked one evening. Sarah considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "Survival was never just about coming back to you. It was about proving to myself that I was more than what happened to me, that I could endure, that I could overcome, that I could claim my life and live it fully. And being here with you, flying the B-2, mentoring young pilots, that's all part of claiming that life. That's the real victory." Alina took her daughter's hand, the way she had when Sarah was small, and squeezed it gently. No more words were needed. The two of them sat together as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge one by one in the night sky, eternal, unchanging, beautiful, like the human spirit that had carried Sarah through her darkest hours and brought her home. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell, the pilot declared KIA who returned 15 years later, became part of American mythology, a story of suffering and survival, of love that transcended death, of the unbreakable human will. But for Sarah, it was simply her life. A life reclaimed. A life lived with purpose. A life worth all the suffering that had come before. And that was triumph enough.